You're watching How to Safely Incorporate Fasting into Your Busy Life by Dr. Alyssa Gall on Resonance Wellness TV, part of our Whole Life Medicine Alleviate series. Keep in the loop about future webinars and events on whole-life-medicine.com. Hello and welcome to How to Safely Add Fasting to Your Busy Life. My name is Dr. Alyssa Gall and I will be your guide this evening about all things foodless. And as usual, this presentation is given in the context of the whole life medicine model. And when we're talking about fasting, we're talking about the clean slate points in Alleviate in the whole life medicine model. And I really have to start up front by admitting that I actually took a course on fasting in medical school. And I actually thought the idea was stupid. In fact, my teacher was an MD who used fasting a lot in his practice. And he made me rewrite my paper because I wrote about how it was useless and more likely to be related to food allergy and that there wasn't really any good research to prove it. And that was true 30 years ago, but it turned out as time went on that the data started to come in. So apologies, doctor, whoever you were, apparently some of what you said was right. And so fasting now has some very interesting research data behind it. And I'm hoping today to share what that says about how and when to use fasting for health. And lots of the resonance community was super excited about this lecture, and I'm excited to present it to you. So let's take a look first at history. You know, I love the history of all of these things. And so the history of fasting is that it really has existed as an ancient practice for multitudinous millennia. Most of the major religions around the world have fasting incorporated into their holiest days of the year. For example, Ramadan is the month-long fast where Muslims do not eat or drink during daylight hours. I have it under good advisement that if it happens like in summer or close to summer here, that the time frame is actually widened a bit because obviously in the middle of some of our year we have very long daylight hours at this latitude. Christians have Lent. That's the 40 days prior to Easter. That starts on Ash Wednesday. So I don't know how many of you have ever incorporated that if you're Christian, but there are food restrictions, like on weekdays, meat, eggs, dairy, fish, wine, and oil are restricted. In the week before Lent, all animal products, including meat, are prohibited. Good Friday is the day for a complete fast, and people are encouraged actually to eat nothing. And historically, there's also been a 40-day fasting period in Advent, so that's the time leading up to Christmas. Which we probably could all use, given that Christmas tends to be slightly overkilled. So First Nations also have used fasting, usually before a vision quest. So it's with the intention of creating a clear and receiving mind. And in ancient Greece, fasting was a very common practice. It was considered quite helpful to health. The ancient Greeks were really great believers, and Hippocrates advocated it. So this is a picture here of Hippocrates, basically the founder of the Hippocratic Oath. Plato, famous philosopher, said that he fasted for greater physical and mental efficiency. His pupil Aristotle also fasted, and both Galen and Avicenna, so these two men were physicians pretty instrumental to the beginning of medicine, also prescribed fasts for their patients. Buddhist monks are known to abstain from eating after noon and fasting until the next morning. And they often do things like water-only fasts for days or sometimes weeks on end. The goal there for that religion is to quench human desire, with the idea that it could actually help them to achieve nirvana. And Buddha was supposed to have been fasting when he achieved enlightenment. Hinduism also embraces fasting. So, and in that background, it's thought that our sins lessen as the body suffers. And similar to Buddhism, like cultivating control over desires, guiding your mind towards peace, basically denying the physical needs of the body. And I think they also fast commonly at festivals. And in traditional Ayurvedic medicine, so that's the traditional medicine of India, the cause of many illnesses is ascribed to accumulation of toxins, and often fasting is prescribed. And in fact, in Ayurvedic detox, I used to do elements of panchakarma in my practice. That's an Ayurvedic detox. One of the types of detoxes is actually therapeutic vomiting, which we do not see often in Western culture, but it is incredibly head clearing, as anybody who has vomited could probably say. And there's quite a few historical figures like Benjamin Franklin, Mark Twain. They were both advocates of fasting. And for a while, especially in the late 1800s, fasting was actually a spectator sport. People became fasting artists, and they set up public performances of long-term fasting. So interesting. And then we saw fasting appear in the medical literature probably in the early 1900s. So there was an article in the Journal of Biological Chemistry in 1915 that described fasting as perfectly safe, harmless, and effective method for reducing the weight of those suffering from obesity. But of course, through the late teens, through the 1930s, there was the poverty of the Depression. There was a lot of infectious disease. World wars bookended this time frame from the teens to the 40s. So obesity was really not as big of a problem as it potentially is today. There really wasn't much fasting for health otherwise in this century, other than probably the religious fasting, up until quite late, in this last century here. There's a couple of books that were written that, like as an example, there's one that's called The Miracle Fasting Cure that was written by Paul Bragg. So that's the Bragg of Bragg's Aminos. That's probably one of the few that was in the last, or in the decades of like the 80s, I think. So in any case, I really encourage you to look at fasting in the context of your own cultural or religious heritage. It can be a really beautiful way to incorporate a mind, body, spirit approach, and to think about it as not just a body detox, but also one to still the mind. Obviously, historically, a lot of people have survived a fast. So research actually does show that it can have a beneficial influence on your health. So fasting means that you're limiting how often you eat, or that you don't eat at all during certain times of the day or week or month. It's not the same as eating restricted number of calories, although you might have reduced calories on some days when you fast. And in fact, you might actually eat the same number of calories just in a shorter window of time while you're fasting. So I know that's all confusing, and we're going to go through them, all the different styles. So you can facilitate weight loss, and it can reduce your risk of chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer. So research is supporting modifying that 3 square meals a day approach in favor of different versions of fasting. It really is likely that human beings are not really designed for the patterns of eating that have become common in modern culture. And we're going to talk about that. But before we get into that in the different fasting styles, let's just talk about some of the myths of fasting. So one common fear is that fasting equals starvation, which is not true. First of all, starvation is a forced situation that you have no control over, whereas fasting is optional. You have complete control. And many also believe they cannot or should not fast because it's going to send their body into starvation mode. So a situation where the body starts holding on to fat rather than burning it off. And what they're talking about is where the body's metabolism starts to slow down so significantly that instead of burning like 2,000 calories a day, your body might do 1,000. And in that case, even if you're only eating 1,500 calories, you're going to gain your weight back. And that's actually what happens when you reduce your calories. We know that. So as you cut your calorie intake, your calorie expenditure goes down as well. So starvation mode actually is guaranteed if you just try and cut calories. But what's interesting is that fasting doesn't do that. What happens during fasting is that after about like 4 days of fasting, the basal metabolic rate is actually 10% higher than when you started. Isn't that curious? Now, Another myth is that fasting will cause low blood sugar. You will not deplete yourself of all food energy that's available by fasting. You have many mechanisms that store food energy, and we can retrieve it when we need it. So when you fast, you can use stored fat. You can change your hormones to increase blood glucose as needed, and you can even make glucose from scratch in your biochemistry if you need it. Now, you might, for a number of different reasons, have some limitations in those processes caused by like malnutrition, or, I mean, you need cofactors to produce things in the metabolism. But most people can actually transition relatively easily. So for most people, what creates low blood sugar is having a sugar crash from taking in too much refined sugar, or sometimes people feel like that's what's happening to them. That they feel like they're going into a low blood sugar situation, but a lot of the time it is more likely to be the impact of stress and the nervous system. Another common myth is that fasting is going to lead to loss of muscle mass. So during fasting, you're going to start by burning off all the glycogen in the liver. That's a storage form of carb and sugar. And there's some of that, but there's not unlimited supplies of that. There's a point at which some of those excess amino acids in your body will kind of get burnt up as well. And that's where people say, well, that's where you're burning muscle. But that's not actually what happens. The body never upregulates its protein catabolism. That's the breakdown of proteins. It's never burning muscle. There is a normal turnover of muscle that will go on. There is a certain amount of protein that you need for regular turnover. So when you start fasting, that kind of starts to go down, and then fat oxidation goes way up. So in essence, what you've done is you've switched from burning like sugar, carbohydrate sugar, to burning fat. Many of those mechanisms, like I said, they end up in the same place. They end up in your mitochondria. So you're not using totally different like cells or anything like that. You're just using a different aspect of the normal metabolism. Now, another myth is that fasting will make you binge later. But this is a myth because studies show that calorie intake does only go up a little bit after a fast, but it quickly goes back down. And actually, it results in a lower average calorie intake. So often people coming off of a fast don't really feel hungry like they might have before fasting, and would have actually quite a bit of difficulty trying to eat more than usual. So that is not true. And so you can actually do fasts many different ways, and they're going to engage some of these normal mechanisms in different ways. So we're going to take a look here at some of the most popular types, and I made you a little diagram here. So these are the main types of fasting that are talked about. So the first, in the first column, is a style of time-restricted feeding. So this is a fast where you fast for 16 to 18 hours, and you restrict the time period that you're eating to the 6 to 8 hours of the day. Hence the term 16-8 and 18-6. So that doesn't actually matter. It doesn't matter where on the clock that actually is, although, I mean, ideally it's sometime during the day and not too late at night, because sometimes, well, historically, again, if you look at the religious fasts, you'll see that most people actually do it earlier in the day. But the whole idea is to put what you eat into a smaller window of time. Now, I have to tell you, this is basically a style of intermittent fasting, which my whole existence I've done, not on purpose, because obviously I failed the fasting paper. But I actually was not super keen on breakfast my entire existence. My parents even tried to like get me to eat it. My grandparents would be, horrified that I wasn't eating breakfast. Sometimes I made them cook me lunch. I used to say it must be because it's breakfast food, but it actually isn't that. I just naturally, I'm not inclined to eat breakfast in the morning. And it turns out on my own genetic profiling, because you can actually test for markers that make you better or less efficient at intermittent fasting. I'm actually designed as an intermittent faster body-wise. So I laugh when people call it intermittent fasting and are afraid not to eat breakfast. I can tell you I have survived over half a century doing just that. The second style here is where there's 2 days of the week. So these are non-consecutive days of the week where you spend it fasting all day. Hence the 5 days eating, 2 days off. Again, they are not sequential, so you might put them into convenient days, whatever days that would be for you. The third style is it's kind of what's either known as the warrior method. So that's eating in a 4-hour window, or only eating 1 meal a day over 1 hour per day. That is something that is known as OMAD, OMAD. So if you see a reference to 1 meal a day or OMAD, that's what they're talking about. And the difference between warrior and OMAD is just literally restricting it to 1 hour or restricting it to 4. Typically, people there are only eating dinner. That is the style that has been most common in our, like, probably last 5 or 6 years, when people started to get a little bit more serious about this and write books about it. And last but not least, you can have extended fasting. So that's meaning fasting typically for at least 36 hours, up to maybe 42 without any medical supervision in a row, or doing alternate days where on the fasting day, often a single small meal is consumed. So you can see here that there are a lot of different styles of how a person might fast, and some might actually work better for some people than others. And you won't know often until you try. And in the space between meals, there's also different approaches. So you can do water fasting, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. So you don't eat, you only drink water for several days in a row. And you can also do water plus non-caloric beverages. So a variation on the water fast is you're putting in things like herbal tea or coffee. So without the milk or sugar or sweeteners, you're putting in that non-caloric thing that still has a taste to it. Often this is useful, especially, often their bowel movements will slow down quite a bit in the beginning of fasting, and sometimes the caffeine helps that. A third variation is using bone broth. So this is a variation that is often recommended for longer fasts. So, bone broth contains a whole bunch of different molecules, so it's not like not eating anything. It's not really a true fast, but it's so light that it just helps kind of stave off hunger twangs on longer fasting. And then you can do something that's called fat fasting. So that's where you allow like healthy fats. Again, that's relative to the person, but fats during the fast in addition to water. So a common example of that would be like bulletproof coffee. So that's black coffee with butter or coconut oil, which is MCT oil. You could also add the fat to your tea. There are some places in the world that do that. There's the yak butter preparations I think that is Mongolia. So this is not a new idea either. It's been used for a long time, but these are different approaches to what you would do in between the meals. So basically, we're looking at all sorts of ways of intermittently eating, right? So why would we do this? Okay, so we're going to go back again to a little bit of history. So the idea of 3 meals is very recent in human history, very recent. So in Roman times, 1 meal at high noon was most typical, and eating early and eating late was totally frowned upon. And so we have a different, I think, different cultural perception of the Romans, but really they were very particular about eating things in that window. In Europe in the Middle Ages, people still ate their main meal at noon, and then they had a lighter meal at what we would consider the dinner hour. And what really changed meal timing was A, the Industrial Revolution, and B, artificial light. So during the Industrial Revolution, breakfast became more common because people were typically going to a factory job and they might not get a very big break in a day. So this is what started to create this meal pattern that's held most of the 20th and 21st centuries so far. And artificial light and powered appliances totally helped it along because people could actually stay up later and see what they were doing later in the day, and they weren't dependent on fire-based fuels, at least not in the quote unquote developed world. There are still locations in the world that have fire-based fuels and do not have a great deal of electric light. So our understanding of food history in early periods of human existence is really continuing to develop. I always giggle a little when I hear the term paleo. That was a diet that was coined in 2002, just to be clear. And Paleolithic peoples, nobody knows exactly what Paleolithic peoples actually ate, but it's most likely to have been mostly plants. So tubers and seeds and nuts, any, wild grown barley that was pounded into flour, legumes, probably eating flowers. Paleolithic people would have had fire and stone tools. So it's believed that they were able to process and cook foods like that. Also, lean, small game animals were the main animals eating. So some estimates animal products contributed to only about 3% of that whole diet. So animals hadn't even been domesticated. So dairy products were probably not included. The diet probably included shellfish and other smaller fish. And it would have been a major component of the diet in coastal regions. There has been some evidence that have shown that food containers dating from that window have a lot of seafood and fish and stuff in them. And insects, tons of insects and their products. So actual insects, and then honeycombs, they were a major fallback food probably in that window of time. So recently there's more interest in edible insects. And I think the United Nations actually released a list of edible insects as an alternative to meat products. Because it's basically similar nutritional benefits. Now, I'm assuming nobody on this meeting is like, woo, let's go get some insect, but as a paleo thing. But I think it's always important to look at what is the true history and evidence of something. Just because somebody called something a Paleolithic diet does not mean they actually know that that's the case. So it's important, though, to realize that, in order to lose body fat, your body must have the opportunity to actually burn fat stores. So this is what taking breaks in eating actually does. It turns over your stored fuel. And most of us have more than enough stored fuel. So a lot of those classic, millennia old eating patterns actually were probably healthier than what we are doing at this point in time, where people panic if they do not have snack food in their purse. Now, well, probably 80% of the population would likely benefit from water fasting, really. There's several absolute contraindications. So if any of the following apply to you, you really should not do extended types of fasting. The first is being already underweight, so defined as your body mass index, or your BMI, of less than 18.5. B, if you're malnourished. People who have like deficiencies or depletions or already cachexic, they should not be fasting. C, children should not fast for longer than 24 hours, especially early on. They really need nutrients for continued growth. So if your child needs to lose weight, a far safer and more appropriate approach is to cut out the things they shouldn't be eating, like refined sugars and grains. So fasting is risky for kids. It's cutting out everything that they need a steady supply of. You also should not be fasting if you're pregnant or breastfeeding. A mother needs a steady supply of nutrients also in order to basically grow a baby and also to produce appropriate milk. Now, you also don't want to be fasting with diabetes type 1. You will need medical supervision for that. Type 2, okay. Type 1, not okay. Not without close supervision. Recent stroke or heart attack, pulmonary embolism or deep vein thromboses, If you know you have cardiac instability with uncontrolled like fibrillation or something like that, this is not a good meal plan for you. Severe kidney disease, porphyria. There's a disease called MCAD, which is a deficiency of some of an enzyme involved in fatty acid burning. Those people that would be deadly. The fasting would be deadly to them. If you can't discontinue most of the medications that you're on for whatever reason, that is a contraindication unless you're closely supervised. It isn't unusual for people in extended fasting conditions to have to modify medications, especially diabetes medications or cholesterol medications or blood pressure medications. And if you're not well rested, this is more stress on your body, so I wouldn't do it. But you can totally fast with, if you just have obesity, elevated blood lipids, high blood pressure, or cardiovascular disease that's relatively stable, type 2 diabetes, like I said, metabolic syndrome, GI imbalances, you can still fast, autoimmune disorders for sure. And in fact, the fellow who taught me in the beginning he really used fasting a lot for autoimmune disorders. Even when people have like dependence or toxicity on, they can probably fast. They should probably do some modifications, but you can fast. And also lymphoma. You can fast during lymphoma and other types of cancers, depending on what stage you are in. And there are some time frames in a plan, even if you're incorporating chemo and radiation, where fasting is a good idea. Which if you've ever been with me during a set of circumstances like that, I would often recommend certain fasting. Now, other benefits of intermittent fasting. Oh, sorry, Johanna had a question. Is it a contraindication for all the fasting types? The 16-8 fasting too. You would still want supervision under those circumstances. I think if you are a 16-8, you could probably most people get away with that, even if they are on medications. It really depends on how ill you are. But water-only fasting for a more extended period of time, you do really want supervision. And I think if you have any of those conditions, you should tell somebody in advance that that's what you're going to do, because you have the potential for needing an adjustment in meds quite quickly. So I would be a bit careful with it for sure. Make sure somebody knows who's supervising. So the confirmed health benefits are these. There's actually a huge list. I'm just going to name some of them. So when you fast, you release ketones into your bloodstream. So ketones are naturally produced things in your metabolism. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, there was like a big push for people to eat ketones on purpose, which, okay, a little bit, but really the whole reason that ketones show up is because you're actually putting your metabolism into a totally different mode. So ketones preserve brain function, and they protect against epileptic seizures and cognitive impairment and other neurodegenerative diseases. In fact, Hippocrates fasted epileptics to create this effect. And that would be, multiple millennia ago. So amazing that people figured that out that quickly. Fasting also boosts production of brain-derived neurotropic factor. That stimulates the creation of new brain cells, and it triggers brain chemicals that protect against the brain changes associated with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And I'm going to share a little bit more research about that in a minute. It increases growth hormone by as much as 1,300% in women and 2,000% in men. So it promotes muscle development. It lowers insulin. It improves insulin sensitivity. And you can both prevent and reverse type 2 diabetes rooted in insulin resistance a great deal of the time. You also increase levels of the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. That helps your body break down fat to be used as fuel. You upregulate something called autophagy. I would say autophagy. Sorry, it's a term I normally read, don't say. And mitophagy. basically what that is where you are turning over cell components more quickly. And we're going to talk about that and the research on that again in a moment. It lowers oxidative stress and inflammation. It improves your glucose and lipid levels. It reduces blood pressure. It actually reproduces some of the cardiovascular benefits associated with exercise. So it's like lazy man exercise can be done this way. It does protect against cardiovascular disease. It improves immune function, and it does tend to change your like sugar cravings and food cravings as you get more into it. So let's look at a couple of these in more detail where the evidence is. And so in cancer and dementia, the sensitivity of cancer cells to nutrient and energy deficiency is actually an evolving research area in the study of cancer biology. So there are preclinical studies now that show pretty good evidence that energy and calorie restrictions could hinder both cancer growth and progression, enhance the efficacy of chemo and radiation therapy. And there are some smaller clinical trials that have demonstrated clinical benefits in cancer patients during their cancer treatment. That group of people is, they're very careful about how they do studies in people in treatment, because obviously we also want the best outcomes in cancer treatment, and you don't want something negative to happen. So often they will do small, limited time frame trials to prevent that from becoming an issue for individuals. There was one study in 2016 that actually showed a combination of fasting and chemo slowed progression of breast cancer and skin cancer. Basically, the bodies were producing higher levels of lymphoid progenitor cells and tumor infiltrating lymphocytes. So these are kinds of white blood cells that are migrating into a tumor and help kill tumors. So that same study noted that short-term starvation makes cancer cells sensitive to chemo while protecting normal cells, and it also promotes the production of stem cells. So this is relatively new evidence, and my more recent cancer patients are doing fasting around their chemotherapeutic regimens. Now, intermittent fasting can also have a pretty good impact on your brain function and can even help aid in preventing and potentially mitigating Alzheimer's disease. So fasting actually delays the development of Alzheimer's and dementia and memory loss in mouse models. So they use mice that have a genetic modification that makes them produce that beta amyloid protein that's a characteristic of Alzheimer's. Lots of people have heard of that. It's like a protein that accumulates in your brain, and it seems to be related in some way to the way that Alzheimer's is produced. It's not all of the story, but it's a marker. So if you do studies on these kind of mice that have, like, they've basically been artificially induced to produce these proteins, they show if they have like this kind of intermittent energy restriction, they delay the onset of dementia in a mouse by 6 to 12 months. That's like being 80 before developing Alzheimer's if you already have the predisposition. So interestingly, if you feed those mice a fast food diet, that high fructose and high fat creates a dramatic increase in learning and memory disorders. That's like getting dementia at like 40. So 3 or 4 months sooner than they would be expected in mice, right? So I'm projecting here just age-wise. So if you use fasting in mice, you can see that mice brains show new brain cells when you do that. So hunger seems to trigger new neurons to grow. So the theory is that the increased cognition is increasing survival. So hunger really does make you sharper. Now, granted, it's making you sharper in looking for the fridge sometimes. And that's what it's supposed to do in animals too, right? It's supposed to help them to survive. And those studies obviously have not been replicated in humans because that would be considered unethical. But observational studies, so studies of just watching people over time, what they eat and what they suffer from, basically show really similar trends. So fasting is actually thought to improve the chance of decreasing that risk of Alzheimer's in human beings enough that fasting researchers, I guarantee you, are doing that for themselves. And again, it also depends on your genetics. So Some of you might know what your genetic predisposition is, and if you have that, fasting actually would be very useful in that regard, quite likely. And, like other studies before it, recent research really shows that fasting can improve insulin sensitivity, it can reverse type 2 diabetes, it can support your weight management efforts when you combine it with exercise. And so there's research that was done on the fasting prayer practices of Muslims during Ramadan. And they actually collected blood samples before people did their religious fast and at the end of the 4th week. And then also 1 week post-fasting. So fasting for 30 days raised levels of molecules that improved insulin resistance, reduce the adverse effects of a diet that's typically rich in sugar in this particular locale where they did this study. And they also found that it was key in maintaining the health of cells. And so they saw cell marker improvements across the board. Now, what's interesting, I wanted to point this out, but in Ecuador, there's a little group of people with a dwarfism condition. It's called Laron syndrome. And in this population of these people with Laron syndrome, there is no diabetes or cancer, even though they have a lousy lifestyle. Like, food choices are not great in this location. And they're small people. They're about 3 feet tall. But they are totally protected against these diseases. And it's because their bodies produce very low levels of IGF-1. Now, we're going to talk about this in a sec. So it's a molecule that slows the production of new cells and pushes the body to repair cells instead. And this is actually the thought, or the research thought, as to why these people have such little disease, even though they have a very high fat, damaged fat diet. If they have this syndrome with this very low levels of this molecule, they literally do not get cancer or diabetes. So there's a population that people have studied. So very, very interesting. Now, what does IGF stand for? Insulin-like growth factor 1. Very, very interesting. It's also a molecule that is used a lot in your immune system. So there's interactions with your immune system as well. So if you look at animal studies, you'll see that there's remarkable increases in lifespan with restricted feeding. But there's not many human studies about that because our lifespans are basically too long to plan a really good study around it so far. We'll probably have more data in the next couple of decades as some of those studies would be starting now. But if you eat less or fast or cut protein intake, all of these things are actually changing insulin-like growth factor. So that is probably what links the calorie restriction and longevity. But of course, most people don't restrict anything. Fasting gives a really dramatic and quick response in decreasing IGF-1. The normal range of IGF is 80 to 230 in the bloodstream. If you fast for 3 days and 4 nights, so that would be considered an extended fast, you could likely reduce that level by half. It's substantial. So in essence, you are, like I said, shifting things away from producing new cells indiscriminately, because that's what we normally will do if you've got enough fuel, is you just kind of keep building, but it actually forces you to repair older cells. So this is why fasting improves biological repair and rejuvenation. So if you eat a lot of protein, you'll push the cell to burn fuel and it just pumps out cells, and it decreases cell repair in the ones that already exist. So if you have an absence of food, you get much better biological repair and rejuvenation processes. So an all-day grazer can actually, especially under the wrong genetic circumstances, that could trigger disease. Your body just never really has time to go back and revise damage because you're constantly bringing things in and trying to deal with that. So if you go without food, you get this natural cleansing process. Like I said, it's called autophagy, or mitophagy. So mitophagy is in the case of mitochondria, where your body is literally detoxifying and getting rid of damaged cells or repairing them. So if you're constant feast mode, your body just forgoes many of those benefits. That doesn't mean you need to starve yourself for extended periods of time. Just cycling between periods of eating and fasting on one of these daily or weekly schedules has been shown to provide many of those same benefits as complete fasting, where you're not eating for several days. So you could use whatever style actually appeals to you. Now, there's another recent study that shows that omitting a meal before an early workout, like exercise obviously is going to play an important role in weight management. And past studies, though, have shown that people who begin a new exercise program often compensate for the energy burned by eating more later in the day, or like moving less later in the day. So in this one particular study, they enrolled healthy, physically active young men, and they basically completed 3 stages in a randomized order, where in one stage, the participants ate a breakfast of oats and milk, followed by rest. In the other, they had the same breakfast and then exercised. And then in another stage, they fasted overnight and then exercised in the morning before eating. So then they followed the 24 hours of caloric intake after that. And the researchers found that those who fasted and then exercised had a 400 calorie lower intake in the day, as opposed to those who ate and rested or ate breakfast before exercising. So again, simple little changes in the way that you do things may actually improve your capacity to lose some of those extra resources that you have on your butt. So there are some other points to consider. And like I said, it doesn't have to be a form of calorie restriction. It's a practice that should make you feel good. So if your fasting strategy is making you feel weak or lethargic, you need to reevaluate your approach. Sugar cravings are temporary. So your hunger and craving for sugary things will slowly dissipate as your body starts burning fat as the primary fuel. And then once you've successfully shifted into like pulling out your stores, it'll be easier for you to fast for as long as 18 hours and still feel absolutely fine. It's really not advisable to start intermittent fasting if your daily diet is filled with processed foods. It sounds obviously like, the way I'm giving you this information, it sounds like a panacea against ill health and excess weight, but by itself, it's not going to produce all the benefits. The quality of your diet still plays an important role if you're looking for more than just mere weight loss. And even then, with weight loss, your diet still has a big role to play. So you want to avoid refined carbohydrates and sugar and fructose and grains, especially not whole grains, and especially in big volumes. So you're going to focus your diet on veggies, like like the carbohydrates that come from vegetables as opposed to grains, healthy protein in moderate amounts, healthy fats, butter, eggs, avocado, coconut oil, olive oil, nuts. And again, to reinforce, it is known that when you look at mitochondrial function, it's not a great idea to eat late at night. That's when your body is readying for your rest and regeneration and repair. If you eat in the evening after dinner, it creates surplus energy, and it just creates way more damaging reactive oxygen species. So when you're fasting, it actually is a good idea to make sure dinner is your last food. And ideally, you're not going to eat within 3 hours of bedtime. And honestly, that's universally true, fasting or not. You really shouldn't be eating little snacks in front of the TV before going to bed, which all of us do sometimes. But if you can avoid that, you should try. So, if the idea of fasting for lots of days seems a bit daunting, there's ways to ease into it. To that, just increase your intermittent daily fasting from like 16 hours all the way up, to 21 maybe. Leave yourself a 3-hour window where you eat all your food for the day. Try it for a month or 2, and then try a 4-day fast. You'd be surprised what you can do. You don't necessarily need to do intermittent fasting for 18 months before trying a water-only fast, but if you're doing it for a few months, it would radically decrease any negative side effects for sure. So if you want to try a multi-day fast, consider extending your intermittent fasting, like the 16-8 or the 24. and then work your way up into it. And remember, you're in complete control. You can try it how you like it. And if you don't like it, well, you can stop. So if you feel super uncomfortable, a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of craving is typical, but a lot is not. So like I said, what you eat still matters. You can't just binge on whatever you want on non-fasting days. I really would recommend paying attention to the quality of your food, regardless of how you're going to choose to do it. And because you're eating less, so you want to make sure you get high quality nutrients from your food. And making sure you eat fats, especially important because intermittent fasting, like I said, is pushing your body to switch over into fat burning mode. So if you feel tired and sluggish, it might just mean that you need to readjust the amounts. And you're going to like cut net carbs and cut fructose. Fructose, when you take that in, and that's the stuff that you find in like high fructose corn syrup, a lot of like intense fruit juices, right? Super concentrated fruit juices. We talked about this in the sugar lecture. If you missed that, you've got to go back and take another look at that. But eating a lot of fructose activates a kind of enzyme, fructokinase, which actually in turn activates another enzyme that causes your cells to accumulate fat and just basically resists letting any of it go. So you're inducing storage phase with fructose, because fruit typically happens in summer. You eat all this fruit and you're basically storing all of it for the winter, because just in case you're going to have to hibernate or fuels are going to be less, less available in the winter. Now, of course, we live in a culture where that's not the case. We can walk into a heated grocery store where we can buy anything from anywhere, but this is the natural inclination. So if you're overweight or insulin resistant or diabetic, reducing your sugar consumption is really key. And as a general rule, whether you're fasting or not, again, good quality, high quality protein from organically raised, grass-fed, pastured animals. You shouldn't really need more than 40 to 80 grams of protein a day. Unrestricted amounts of fresh, like low net carb veggies, again, ideally organic. These are things that I know you've heard me talk about many times. So obviously, besides, when and what to eat, that another common question is duration. And, you can embrace it as a lifestyle or do it accidentally like I do. And then, if you can do it where you're restricting your daily eating to a specific window of time. It's not something you have to do for the rest of your life. And again, like I said before, it does depend on your gene background. So I have the genetic profile where intermittent fasting is actually a good idea. I don't really mind more formal forms of fasting, but not everybody is the same. So you can do something like, peak fasting, where you would do it every day rather than a few days a week, but you can certainly cycle in off days during, because you might have something difference in your schedule or social commitment. You want to just be flexible. So alternate day fasting diets are where you can, this is what I'm talking about, alternate day fasting diets. So you're going to take about 500 calories in for a woman, 500 or 600 for a man in one meal around lunchtime, and then alternate it with a day where you eat whatever you would normally eat. So just doing it like that reduces the blood storage fats, the tags. If I've said to you, you need to reduce your tags, this is one thing you can do. It reduces LDL, it decreases blood pressure. There's lots of evidence in animal studies for this. As long as you stick to your calorie goals on the fast day, the feed day doesn't really seem to matter, like in terms of fat content as an example. And after a day of fasting, people rarely eat more than 110% of what they would normally eat in a day. So again, you don't have to be worried that you're going to like go crazy and eat all of that. So there's a couple tips for making it through that transition period. It can take, 7 to 10 days if you're going to do an intermittent fasting plan. It might take you, like I said, a week and a half to adjust, maybe even a little bit longer for some people, depending on how insulin resistant you are and other factors. But But about 10% of people report headaches as a side effect. Obviously, the biggest complaint is hunger, but again, it's helpful to remember why you're craving is because your body is trying to make the switch from burning one type of fuel predominantly to the other. And as long as you're running on sugar, which is like that fast burning fuel, you'll get frequent hunger pangs. But fat really as a fuel is way more satisfying. It's a slower burning fuel. It's also crucial to drink enough water. People can really mistake thirst for hunger. So try drinking water first and then wait 15 minutes and then see how you feel. A diet high in carbs just really inhibits your ability to produce lipase and then use fat as an energy source. So another factor that can trip you up in transition periods is totally psychological. If you're used to grazing through the day, it's going to take you some time to break those habits. And fasting can also bring up emotional eating issues. And if that's true, just be gentle with yourself. And if you need help with it, come in and let's go through it together, because better to figure out that that's the case and where we need to actually do something about it than try and struggle with it yourself or be judgmental of yourself for no good reason. So I know lots of you might have come to this lecture because you're interested in losing weight, and I totally get that. Lots of you are self-starters, and I know you're often are trying to figure out how to shed those extra pieces. And for those people who need who need some help with this, I'm going to try and do a couple of things in this next 6-month window. I was thinking about actually having a fasting challenge. So people who are interested in trying it out could kind of do it in a bit of a group with some support. So that might be a great idea. And in October, and I will announce the date on this website, which is alignreset.com, which is not up yet. I'm going to offer a 10-week program to literally lead you through probably an average 20-pound weight loss. And we're going to use intermittent fasting alongside other components. This is called Align Body Reset because, and you remember that Alleviate is like the basic stuff. Align is where you have to really do this well, you often will have to bring in other psychological components and other lifestyle components. But the whole point is to make it permanent and reset your metabolic function. So if you're interested in that, just watch for the email when this website pops up. You'll have the opportunity to do that. But in the interim, we're probably going to do some fasting group work. So if you want to sign up for that, I'm going to hopefully have that up on Facebook in the next little while. I probably will also email it out. So if you're interested, please, consider joining at least that group so you can kind of have, that way I can answer questions as you're going along and having that experience and see if we can troubleshoot things to make it work better for you. Okay, now's your time. Is there any questions that I can answer for you? Anybody have a burning question that they want to know all about? Or are you just like, wow, I'm going to go fast right now. I'm going to stop eating right this moment because it's after dinner and before bedtime, and I should be eating right now. Well, you can always send me your questions on the email. I take a little bit of time sometimes to reply. So these are the next Alleviate webinars in our series. So there's one in November, one in February, one in May. And in fall, our venue for the Align events is actually been under construction. So we're going to move this probably to Dalhousie, also in October. So just watch out for this. If you missed the first Align in-person workshop, it was super fun. We had about 30 people in the workshop, and we had a great time figuring out how to do things with our heart energy. And hopefully you'll join us for the next one. And if you have anybody in your Malo who is a mom of younger kids or thinking about getting pregnant, these are the Helping Dr. Mom episodes that we're going to do in December and March. Now, let me just answer a couple of questions that are coming up here. So, is 14-7 fasting? Sure. Well, 14-7 doesn't add up to 24. That adds up to 21. So are you thinking like 17.7, Maureen? And if people have a sensitivity, there's a question here about sensitivity to apples. If you have a sensitivity for apples, don't eat apple cider vinegar, for sure. There's a lot of apple compounds in apple cider vinegar. Yes, it's 14:10. Yeah. 10 is getting a little, 14 hours fasting, 10 hours eating. I mean, that's not really, no, you would have to do it a little bit tighter than that. I think you're going to have to at least go 16:8. Do you feel like you'd have trouble doing that, Maureen? Like just an 8-hour window or even a 6-hour window? I think you might be surprised, but you can try from where you think you can go and then just, like I said, slowly change the hours. Give yourself a week to adjust and try. Yeah, try it. And of course, everybody knows where I am. Something comes up. Don't feel like you have to do it by yourself. And watch for those emails. I'll try and get people together either for a group fast where we can just all connect to each other, or really, like I said, watch for the linereset.com. We're going to do an amazing program. And if you have 20 pounds or more to shed, that's really the place to do it. It will be super fun. So thank you so much. You always have my heartfelt appreciation. You guys are the best patients and community and visitors. Some of those people who have never quite shown up. And what is the genetic testing? That's actually genetic testing that I use the DNA company. So I have been in the middle of doing a certification for genetic counseling in addition to my other roles. And so I've actually been using the DNA company. So I think it's the DNAcompany.com. And what does cider vinegar do? Sometimes, Angela, people recommend cider vinegar and during fasts. It's just basically a mild acid, and a slight ferment. So people like the effect, like it can make them, they feel like it makes them feel better. I feel like if you have stomach problems, it can decrease or like increase the amount of acid in your stomach, which in some people that's quite good. So I hope you guys all have fun doing this. I hope you are very excited to try. And like I said, you let me know if you need help. All right. All right. So take care of yourselves. I will talk to you soon. I'll see you at the next event. Take care. Thanks for watching. I love to connect to my patient community to inform and inspire, and I hope you'll join us again in the near future. Don't forget to check out whole-life-medicine.com for more webinars and events.